On Wednesday, November the 29th, 1989, 48-year-old Brian Atkinson began the first day of 2 life prison sentences. His crimes were brutal: the kidnap and false imprisonment of a teenage schoolgirl from Northampton and the sexual assault of a Huddersfield housewife, an attack he had hidden for over a decade. And most chillingly, Atkinson would also admit to indecently assaulting 2 other ladies, one in 1987 and one in 1989. It all began during Atkinson's employment with the Country Line bus company in Northampton, and his job mainly involved transporting school children, and through this role Atkinson became fixated on a girl he saw regularly. It was from this obsession that Atkinson would begin to craft a sick plan, a plan to abduct this young girl and then to sexually abuse her. It was on or around May the 24th when he hired a white Renault van from a local company. But this wasn't for transporting passengers. He went on to remove all identifying transfers. He altered the registration number and tax disc, and he sprayed black paint onto the rear window. Then came the kit. He went out and purchased camping equipment, a coil of wire and a tube of superglue. Now, all this wasn't spontaneous. All this was planned. This was well thought out, and this was in preparation for what was to come next. On May the 25th, he parked his coach on Bedford Road, Northampton, where he would leave the keys on one of the seats. Atkinson then drove his newly acquired white van to a place called Ecton Brook, waiting for the girl he had targeted. But it was half-term and she never showed. However, whilst his intended target didn't show, another 17-year-old girl did. And she was waiting at a bus stop because she was making her way towards school to sit some exams. Atkinson, who was still in his bus company uniform, pulled over and offered her a lift. Now, she was hesitant at first, but the uniform reassured her. And with the girl accepting the lift, Atkinson drove not to the school, but to a place called Earls Barton. He sweet-talked her into his car, where he then drove several miles, and he sexually assaulted her. She started to scream, she managed to open one of the doors, and she managed to actually get out to a certain degree, but he dragged her back in and he threatened her with a knife. She panicked. What happened next is quite horrific and frightening. We know he sexually assaulted this young girl, but he also glued her hands together to stop her escaping. And the more she screamed, the more he threatened her. And he said, if you don't stop screaming and shouting for help, I will glue your mouth. Now, Atkinson's plan was to drive and head towards Wales on the M1. But at some point, he pulled over in some kind of lay-by where there was like sandwich vans and other refreshments and things like that where you could buy. He pulled over and he told this young girl that he was going to fetch a coffee. He told her to wait and not to try to escape. Now, the young girl, however, thought differently. While she may have been frightened by this creature, by this monster, she plucked up the courage to open up the van door and she scarpered to a nearby lorry where 2 workmen were sat inside. She told them, she asked them, she pleaded with these 2 guys, these 2 workmen, to help her because she'd been kidnapped. Now, Atkinson had seen, or he saw what was happening, and he casually walked over to this lorry where these 2 men were. And he simply told the guys, she's my daughter, she's obviously a bit frightened for whatever reason, you know, I'll take her home. Now, the 2 workmen, thankfully, didn't believe his story. They kept the girl in the cab and they phoned the police. This obviously frightened Atkinson and he quickly fled. He got in the white van and he fled back towards Northampton. The week before he kidnapped this young 17-year-old from Northampton, Atkinson had actually been arrested by the police for indecent exposure. He was placed on police bail. But if only the police had done the background checks there and then, this young girl certainly, or she may not, well, have been kidnapped. Now, Atkinson, and prior to his arrest, He was living with his new wife Janet in Marlborough Road, Northampton. She was recovering from a serious operation that she'd recently had, but he was also the father of 2 children. He was a loner, he was a quiet man, and he went largely unnoticed. But beneath that mild exterior was a monster with a past that was about to come back and haunt him. It was on the evening of Sunday, January the 2nd, 1972, when 17-year-old Elisabeth Foster left her home on Bleasdale Avenue in Kirkham. The shy, cautious girl was heading, as she always did, to the Pentecostal church on North Road in Preston, where she taught Sunday school. At around 5:30 that evening, Elisabeth had made her way to her usual bus stop, the one that she would always go to each and every weekend when she was making her way over to Preston and that Pentecostal church. But on this occasion, the bus itself was running late. Now, Elisabeth, she waited and she waited. And it just seemed that, this bus, for whatever reason, wasn't arriving. It just wasn't coming. Now, a friend of Elisabeth's, she soon turned up, and together, both the young girls, they made the short walk down to another bus stop. They talked, but then Elisabeth's friend had other duties to attend to, and she left Elisabeth waiting on her own. Now, hiding in the shadows somewhere along Station Road was a young man, a 30-year-old young man. And he pulled alongside Elisabeth and offered her a lift. Now, at the time, one would presume that Elisabeth herself was quite anxious, quite nervous about getting into a car with, all intents and purpose, a stranger. But this stranger she had seen numerous times. He was wearing a bus conductor's uniform, but it was a face that she had most certainly seen many times before. And this man was 30-year-old Brian Herbert Ball. Now, Brian Ball was a familiar face to Elisabeth, a friendly bus conductor who often worked on the same routes on the one in which Elisabeth would often make herself. Now, he pulled up in his car and, as I said, he offered her a lift, and she accepted it. After all, she had no reason to be afraid. But this would be the last time anyone saw Elisabeth alive. With his striking blonde hair and good looks, Brian Ball was a charmer, and it would later emerge that his self-confidence grew at the same time as the number of women he coaxed into kisses and cuddles in isolated country lanes. When Elisabeth didn't return home that night, her parents weren't alarmed, and it wasn't uncommon in 1972 to be out of contact. After all, there was no mobile phones, there was no internet. She may have stayed with relatives in Preston, as she sometimes did after church. A doctor walking his dog in Ray Green stumbled upon a chilling scene. Along a muddy pathway known as Lover's Lane, Elisabeth's body lay in a ditch behind a hawthorn hedge, partially clothed, bruised and beaten. Her life was violently stolen. The post-mortem soon revealed the full horror. Elisabeth had been sexually assaulted, then strangled, and her body had been dumped in Brinning Lane, just a short distance from where her underwear and shoes were later found. Now, interestingly, the post-mortem results would also reveal that the person most likely responsible for the murder of Elisabeth, they also had a rare blood group, and it is known as B secretor. And in the 1970s, and especially in 1972, when this terrible tragedy took place, only 6% of people in Britain had this same blood group. A murder inquiry of staggering scale was launched, and a control room was set up in Kirkham with over 100 detectives assigned to this case. A diary and an address book belonging to Elisabeth was studied, and every single person named in these diaries, in this address book, they would later be interviewed. One detective in charge of this tragic case, he would later reveal that the diaries themselves, well, they would reveal and they would paint a picture of a decent, honest and respectable young girl. And the clues in the diary, well, I would say they didn't really reveal anything which would make Elisabeth to be somebody she wasn't. She was deeply religious, God-fearing, as her father would later be quoted as saying. And she wasn't the type of young girl who would willingly get into a car with a stranger. Forensics would also make plaster casts of tyre tracks near the body. They would also discover red paint flecks as well as upholstery fibres. Every man in Kirkham was asked for a sample. over 10,000 blood tests taken, 35,000 people interviewed, and still no suspect. 11 weeks quickly went past, and then a breakthrough in April 1972. The police began to scour through scrapyards and abandoned lockups throughout the Blackpool and Fylde areas, and then they found it. As they strolled among old wrecks in one yard near Kirkham, they found a suspicious vehicle, an MG Magnet Saloon with a maroon and black A60 tyre body. The tyres were missing, rear end was splashed with paint, but one detail stood out, a tyre with a rubber plug matching a plaster cast from the scene of the murder. Now, samples of paint, the carpet and the upholstery of the inside of this car, they were taken, and they would match some of the dust particles found on the clothing belonging to Elisabeth. The car had been scrapped, but the owner kept meticulous records, and the tyres were a make known as Fisk, and they matched perfectly. The car had last been registered to Brian Herbert Ball, a married bus driver from Lancashire, the same Brian Ball who offered Elisabeth a lift. At the time of Elisabeth's murder and the placing of her body somewhere along this stretch of Lovers Lane, Brian Ball himself was 30 years old or thereabouts. He was also a married man with 2 young children. For 3 months after the murder, Ball himself carried on life as normal, going to and from work, mingling with other young adults, young girls. And his wife, even though they're having marriage difficulties from all accounts, she still had no clue to what his other personalities, let's say, were like. She didn't have a clue that he was meeting other young girls and bringing them to places such as this. Such was his charm, his intellect, and obviously the job that he did. He was on bus routes all day long, probably 7 days a week. So he had easy access to these young girls. Eventually, detectives knocked on his front door, and when taken in for questioning, the police looked into his past, revealing that he had no previous convictions and he was not regarded as the sort of menace who would attack women. Even workmates upon his arrest said that Ball was the last one you would have imagined who would have done a terrible thing such as murdering Elisabeth. But to the detectives who interviewed him, he came across as a callous, seedy womaniser. With the police now having Ball in custody, they obviously did everything they had to do. And one of those things would be to test his blood. So after taking the sample, his blood was sent off, and it matched perfectly to that of the evidence that was found either on the clothing or the body of Elisabeth Foster. He was also a B secretor, a perfect match. With the police now having their man, the culprit, they had to dig a little deeper. And they soon found his work history. And again, this kind of feeds into his calculating, if you will, when it came to the abduction of Elisabeth Foster, as well as obviously meeting other young girls. He'd worked for the Ribble Bus Company for around 7 years. Much longer than any other job or any other post he'd held in other jobs. From all accounts, he was a plumber, he was a welder, he was a petrol pump attendant. He had an array of jobs, but it was working on the buses and for the Ribble Bus Company where Ball himself spent the majority of his working life. Not surprising, really, when you consider he had easy access to all these young girls, these young women. Ball will be charged with the sexual assault and of course the murder of Elisabeth Margaret Foster. And it was during his trial at the Lancaster courts, such was Ball's self-confidence, as we obviously all now know about, he testified himself to picking up Elisabeth. He then spoke of how he took her to Inskip, which I said was that small, or which is that small village here in Lancashire. But disturbingly, he had no remorse. And he simply said that Elisabeth herself was more than willing to hop into his car. She was more than willing to have sex with him. He told at the courts how he brought Elisabeth to Ray Green here, just outside of Kirkham, where they went to Lovers Lane, and that is where they had sex. There are conflicting reports over where he actually did murder Elisabeth. Some newspaper articles say that it may well have taken place over in Inskip, and he brought the body back to Ray Green and obviously just off Brinning Lane to where Lovers Lane is. But yet some papers also state that Ball himself testified in court to bringing her to Lovers Lane where they had sex. So this then led a lot of people to think that perhaps Ball himself, he may have killed Elisabeth in Inskip, strangled her after she started screaming and panicking, but he may well have had sex with her body here in Ray Green, in Lovers Lane, before throwing her body over that hedgerow and into the field opposite. We will never know the exact truth behind where and how Elisabeth died, but we do know that he would admit to picking her up. But it's the fact that he tried to darken her name. He tried to imply that she was more than a willing participant, and it was only because she started screaming and panicking that he placed his hands over her throat and suffocated her. And after she sadly died and he realised she was now dead, he himself panicked and brought her here to Ray Green. Now, of course, this was just Ball's version of events, but Elisabeth's father, Thomas, our church leader, told a different truth. His daughter, a devout Christian in her faith, as we touched upon further along Lovers Lane, he said she would never have given herself willingly, not to anyone, especially not to a 30-year-old man. He went on to say that it doesn't matter what the world thinks. I know my daughter, my family knows her. She was a God-fearing girl, brought up in a strict and respectable way. She lived by the Bible for her religion and social work. Humanly speaking, I cannot really forgive, but through Christ he forgives, and being a Christian, that is what I must do. Even Margaret, Elisabeth's mother, she would later say that obviously the family knew Elisabeth more than anybody. And Margaret said that Elisabeth would not willingly get into the car of a stranger, a relatively unknown person, because at the end of the day, even though Elisabeth may have seen Ball on the buses, she didn't know him. She certainly did not know him. And both parents knew this, and they knew that her daughter, or their daughter, would not willingly get into a stranger's car. On October the 20th, 1972, and after a 4-day trial, Brian Herbert Ball was convicted, not of murder, but for manslaughter. And he was sentenced to just 10 years in prison. It was whilst in prison that Ball's wife, Margaret, she was granted a divorce. She went to the authorities begging for a divorce. And she would later tell reporters that it was whilst he was awaiting trial, he confessed to the sexual assault and to the murder of Elisabeth. She knew the marriage was over and she no longer wanted anything to do with her husband. So she put in place motions and obviously to get this divorce done as quickly as possible. And eventually she would be granted that wish. And again, she would tell waiting reporters at the end of it all that he was a horrible man and she no longer wanted anything to do with him, and she no longer wanted to ever see him again. Brian Herbert Ball, after serving just 4 years of a 10-year prison sentence, he was released from prison. He would go on to vanish from public record, but not from the world.
quiet of the night, my thoughts drift like whispers in the wind, echoes of laughter, now just dust left in the cold, empty sound. Memories linger like shadows in the dark, each one a whisper, a sigh, a tear in the dark. Underneath the moon's soft silver light, a lonely path where only ghosts take flight. The silence speaks louder than any voice in this vast emptiness where memories...
Just 4 years into a 10-year sentence, and Brian Herbert Ball was freed. He was a free man. And one of the first things that he would look into, and he would succeed in doing, would be changing his name by default. And he would change his surname to Atkinson. He was now Brian Atkinson. He was like a snake shedding its skin, basically. He wanted a new identity. With a new identity and no official trace of his previous conviction, Atkinson later found work at Country Lion, a Northampton-based bus company on St James Mill Road, Northampton. It was there where he would dupe his employers into believing that he had never driven or even worked on the buses before. They would send him away, obviously on his training, and in time he would find himself permanently employed by this Country Lion bus company. Now, John Bull, he was the company boss of Country Lion Bus Transportation Company. He later would go on to say that if, obviously, Atkinson, as he's now known as, had have applied under his original name of Brian Herbert Ball, the red flags would have been raised and, obviously, his application would have been rejected, simply rejected. Somebody who had targeted a young girl, somebody had been charged and sentenced to serve time in prison for the murder of that young girl. He wouldn't have worked on the buses and certainly wouldn't have worked anywhere where other children or young adults would have been. I mean, buses, school runs, etc. He just would not have got a job with that bus company. Now, with a new name and a new slate, Atkinson, as we'll now refer him to him, he didn't go out there to seek redemption into the world. He never went into the world to seek any redemption whatsoever. He never showed any emotions or any guilt for what he did back in 1972. Instead, he was simply a predator waiting for his next prey. It was in May of 1989. Atkinson, he pretty much replicated what he did back in 1972, but this time, luckily, the victim managed to escape. Now, at this point, I should add that the young girl in question, her name hasn't been revealed and we can't find any traces anywhere of who this young girl was, but the actual article itself is most certainly there in the public domain. Now, as for the two lorry drivers, it was obvious to them that this girl was indeed frightened. She was frightened for her life. After all, her hands were still glued together at this point. She managed to open the door, scarp her out, she got help. So they didn't believe Atkinson's story of him being her father. Now, the police, when they arrived, they took the girl away, they questioned her, and almost instantaneously, within hours, a bulletin had been put out, a dragnet all across the United Kingdom to find Atkinson. They had a picture, they also had a name. How they got the name quickly, maybe it was on his uniform that he was wearing on the evening of the abduction itself, we aren't too sure. But all we know is that the police certainly had a name, and with that name they could also get a photograph or an image. A dragnet was quickly arranged. Newspapers, local newspapers, they began to print and circulate the following morning pictures of Atkinson. There was also a local news bulletin put out in which obviously the photograph of Atkinson was shown. And it was early the following morning when a dog walker was walking past and he noticed this white Renault van. It matched the description of that being made in all the news outlets. He quickly phoned the police and the police made their way They found Atkinson fast asleep in the seat of this van, and he was immediately arrested. It was during his arrest that Atkinson went on to admit the sexual assault of a 36-year-old housewife, and he committed this crime 10 years prior in 1979. The 1979 incident is truly horrific. He had befriended a woman in the same mill in which he was working at, but he had also befriended her husband. And as a threesome, they used to go out for drinks together on at least 2 occasions. Nothing more, just friendly drinks. They thought he was a friend. Now Atkinson must have got word that on one evening in particular she would be alone, and he went to this lady's house. Once he was inside, he attacked this woman. He forced her onto the floor and banged her head onto the stone floor several times, where he then began to sexually assault her. Now obviously we don't know why this wasn't reported, or it may have been reported, but certainly he got away with that assault. He was never charged for that assault back at that time. So obviously the years went by. This woman, this housewife, she would have been extremely frightened. How Atkinson got away with that is anybody's guess. We don't want to speculate, we can't go any further into that story, but all we know is that he did admit to sexually assaulting this housewife in 1979. Now this would come back at the Oxford Crown Courts, and obviously this would be part of the jury's thinking behind the sentences that they were going to impose on Atkinson. Now obviously with Atkinson now being arrested for the abduction of this young girl in Northampton, the police did the digging and they looked into his background, and obviously it didn't take long before the files, the notes came out about the murder, the sexual assault of Elisabeth Foster in 1972. They also interviewed many friends, people who knew Atkinson in 1989, and everybody, just like they said in 1972, they all thought they'd got the wrong man. He was too innocent, he was a nobody, he was a quiet man. But the police, on the other hand, it would later emerge, always felt that there was something cold and eerie about Atkinson. He wasn't this friendly character that people seemed to know. They got the impression he was cold, he was calculating, he was sinister. They just got that feeling. Now obviously they couldn't prove this, they needed more. So they looked into the other case files of the young girl who he apparently attacked in the 1980s. And again, they found the evidence. They could back all this up. He was basically admitting to all this. He was openly admitting to all this. So the police found it quite easy to find everything they needed to get a conviction. Now, more strikingly, the police also realised that upon his release, it was in 1977 when Atkinson indeed changed his name by default. And he went from Brian Herbert Ball to Brian Atkinson. Now, I don't know the ins and outs, I don't know the rules, the laws, but I find it quite hard to understand how a sexual predator who was charged with sexually assaulting a young girl and murdering her, how somebody could be allowed to change the name. Perhaps things have changed since this, I just honestly do not know. But when I first read this case, I was really shocked how easy it was for him to be allowed to change his name and to get away with what he did in the subsequent years after 1977. And he managed to get away with this because of his name change, because his old name wasn't being traced anywhere, because he was allowed to sign up and get a job working on the buses. Like the company bus manager said, or owner said, John Bull, if they'd have known his real name, he would certainly not got a job working for that company. Now, the young girl who was abducted in 1989 and who was driven over 100 miles heading towards Wales, she actually asked Atkinson if he was going to kill her. And he replied saying something on the lines of, no, as long as you behave yourself. Now, everything we know about Atkinson, everything he did in 1972, would lead to the suggestion that that was probably a lie. And he was probably going to do horrible things to this young girl, as he did to Elisabeth Foster in 1972. He probably would have done what he was planning to do and then probably take the life of that young girl. We'll never know, fortunately, because she managed to have the courage to escape. and she sought help with those two lorry drivers, and those two lorry drivers saw right through Atkinson's lies. But if it wasn't for her bravery in doing so, I personally believe there's a good chance that Atkinson may well have taken that young girl's life. The jury in the Oxford Crown Courts didn't take too long to come to a decision, and that was guilty. Guilty, obviously, of the abduction of this young girl in Northampton. And because of his background, because his admittance to obviously attacking other young girls and this housewife, the judge made the decision to hand down 2 life sentences. As far as we're aware, Brian Atkinson is still in prison to this day. We've not found any other information regarding him. We don't know if he, like I said, if he has died, passed away whilst in prison. So we just presume he is still alive, very much alive, and spending the rest of his days in prison. But the judge certainly didn't hold back. And obviously, everything that had gone by before, I mean, we're looking at 4, if not more, attacks on young girls. One certainly led to murder. Chances are there were probably dozens of other attacks which he probably didn't admit to. We'll never know, I guess. But the judge certainly threw everything they could at Atkinson, and he sentenced him to serve at least 2 life sentences. Now, if you have heard of this story before, don't forget to leave a comment down below. Tell me your thoughts. Do you understand why or how a convicted criminal is allowed to change their name by default? For me, Atkinson was cunning, calculated. He was cold. He knew exactly what he was doing by changing his name. He knew he wouldn't get a job working around young children if he'd kept his old name. His name would have been flagged and his applications for jobs would have been shut down. But tell me your thoughts down below. We're going to leave it here. Don't forget to comment, subscribe, and also don't forget to click that little notification bell, because it will let you know when a new video is about to be uploaded. We do try to bring the story out each and every Monday evening, UK time at 7:05 in the evening. So if you could do all those things, comment, share, subscribe, give us a thumbs up, it does help the channel. And myself and Vicky really do appreciate all the support you guys keep giving us. But in the meantime, guys, I want you to stay safe, stay curious, and we will be back soon with more tales from a dark, but at times glorious past.